Welcome to episode 2 of the Liberty Itch podcast. My guest today is Canberra-based libertarian political philosopher Jonathan Cole. Jonathan is a true expert in the nuances, benefits and limitations of the different branches of libertarian theory. So, as a fellow writer for Liberty Itch and host of the Political Animals podcast himself, I called on Jonathan to provide an overview of the landscape of libertarian theories and how they could be implemented in Australia. Unfortunately, we went off on some tangents along the way, entirely my fault, but I've provided timestamps to spare you some pain. I'm sure you won't enjoy the discussion as much as I did at the time, but I hope that you enjoy it nevertheless. Feel free to leave your criticisms and complaints in the comments. Mr. Jonathan Cole, welcome to the Liberty Itch podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Damon.
It's a pleasure and an honour. So the first thing, I think you're the perfect person, given your academic background, in explaining, please, what is libertarianism?
The libertarian seeks to maximize individual freedom in all domains and dimensions of life, subject only to the limiting principle of non-aggression, where aggression means violence, coercion, and or fraud, depending on what kind of libertarian, against other individuals. So limited only by acts of violence, aggression, you should be free to do anything you want as an individual. And then just two things worth putting underneath that to flesh out a full definition.
Sure,
the libertarian believes that private property is integral to that project of maximizing individual or personal freedom, that it simply cannot be done in any system that does not recognize private property. And the libertarian also, and this is perhaps a distinguishing feature in contrast to other ideologies, recognizes that the state itself can be an obstacle or constraint on the individual exercising their personal freedom. And here's the key one. And also that the state can be a perpetrator of aggression itself against citizens, its own citizens, as well as citizens living in other states.
Which I'm sure we've all seen evidence of in very recent years, in fact.
We have.
Okay. That's great. It's, as in the dictionary, it is synonymous with freedom and basically the choice to do whatever pleases you, with the proviso of not harming others in the process, stealing property, etc., etc. Obviously, with something that broad, there are going to be schisms and factions and denominations, shall we call them, amongst the believers in the ideology. So can you please give a broad overview of those various semi-accepted denominations of libertarianism, please?
Yeah. So really, I think there's a couple of ways we can tackle this.
I know.
There are schools of libertarian thought that have, as you know, names like Anarcho capitalism, classical liberalism. But perhaps before we dive into those particular isms, it's just worth noting that there's a spectrum of libertarian thought which really hinges on the extent to which individual freedom can be given. There are differences of opinion about the definition and limits of aggression. And also, there's a big difference of opinion on whether there is a role for the state at all in safeguarding freedom and particularly preventing aggression. So the classical liberal thinks that there is a legitimate role for the state, but it has to be a minimal state. So if you take someone like Ludwig von Mises, who's the classical liberal, excuse the pun, he thought the sole role for the state was to preserve life, health, and safeguard private property. And he thought there had to be some institution, a police force, in order to deal with murderers, to prevent thieves, and also to just ensure that the market is not compromised by things like fraud. But beyond that, there was no role for the state. So when you think about that, that's actually a very tiny micro state compared to any state that we have today on the planet. The anarcho-capitalist says, well, there is no legitimate role for the state. It is illegitimate per se. So we want an anarchist society where people are completely free. It also is very strong on the non-aggression pact, but it thinks that police function could be done by private service providers for a fee, and that really the market can supply all of the functions that a government currently functions more efficiently and to a better quality. And it's just worth noting here the distinction between anarcho-capitalists and some other forms of anarchism, like anarcho-communism. So they both view the state as illegitimate, aggressive, violent. It steals, it's usurping, you can't trust it, it lies.
The cause of all problems throughout the history of mankind, some would say.
That's right. But the communists want a stateless society in which there's no private property. And so there are...
The communists, sorry.
The anarcho-communists. So they want a stateless society in which there's no private property and the people have collective ownership over the means of production. So maybe the workers sort of co-own the factory they work in. This kind of emerged in the industrial age. The anarcho-capitalist says, no, the whole society is going to be based on private property and free enterprise. And a good kind of clue into that is that another word for anarcho-capitalist, or another term that some anarcho-capitalists use to describe their ideal society, is a private law society.
Okay. This is obviously...
So these are the two ends of the libertarian spectrum. It really, if you want to really boil it down...
essentially total freedom versus some borders and fences built around the freedom.
Well, I think the key thing is like the fundamental question is there a legitimate role for the state? No with the anarcho-capitalists. Yes with all other forms of libertarianism. And then those who say yes, then there's a bit of a spectrum of thought of, okay... what's the
how much and how little
state action? And you get everything from kind of small government conservatives who want a state that's a little bit smaller than the big state we have now, all the way down to that Misesian classical liberalism, which by modern standards, the kind of states you and I are familiar with, would mean like a massive reduction in the scope of its activity.
From where we are. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, that's a lot to digest.
Well, it's more a case of obviously given what I think we are used to in modern society, anything going down as far as anarcho-capitalism, to which I should say I personally have affections. But it would be incomprehensible to the majority of the people here. It would be a purely academic, theoretical construct to just go, there's no place for the state and everybody's free to work things out for themselves.
Have you shared this affection with non-believers, so to speak, Damon, as I have, and seen what kind of reaction you get when you try to introduce the notion of a stateless free market society?
Yeah, it pretty much only comes out when I'm at the frothiest stages of one of my rants that people just know not to to stop me. It's like, let's just let him go until he runs out of steam. So it's not something that I've had many deep and meaningful discussions with people about. Because you know that it's too broad of a topic how this would actually work. And
well, it's also very radical, and that's you
100%,
you notice that when you tell someone who's inculcated in, who thinks the current society is generally okay and the role of the government and all that, and you tell them, well, there's this idea of getting rid of the state, but unlike those left-wing communists, we think, I mean anarcho-capitalists think businesses, companies, large and small, and just spontaneous organization, communal organization is going to take care of everything. And not only that, it's going to be a better society, it's going to be wealthier, it's going to be freer, it's going to be more prosperous. And you watch the eyes pop out of the back of the head.
So that would be my next question then, is that obviously there's when you have a culture of people who are used to what we have, it's a giant leap toward full freedom and autonomy in such a way. What are some of the ideas suggested as to how you would get there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
people must be talking about this. Like if we were to look at that as a realistic prospect for a future self-governing society, then it's obviously not going to be a case of just sack the whole lot of them, of the bastards, and let's just get on with it.
Yeah.
It would need to be a gradual winding down and a transitional process that I presume you would think, off the top of my head, you'd be talking a couple of generations in the making, at least.
There's a couple of things really relevant here. And one is, it's important just to remember the non-aggression principle and how central it is to all forms of libertarianism, including anarcho-capitalism. So anarcho-capitalists are very clear that revolution, particularly violent revolution, is just not an option. The idea of seizing the state and you're transitioning through some kind of authoritarian coercive means is not possible. So persuasion is really the only mechanism available. And then you're fighting against what I would call an ingrained status ideology in which virtually all human beings are inculcated in these days from a very young age in terms of their education. And then enormous vested interest. So as the government grows and the class of people that make their living out of the government, which is not just public servants, it's a lot of businesses.
It's virtually every profession in Australian society. It's
publicly funded universities. I mean, the sort of the reach of the government is just extraordinary. So just think about the vested interests in the state edifice continuing as it is. It's kind of like vultures that want a piece of the carcass. So how
100%.
do you convince the citizens, a growing proportion of which benefit from the state, and there's a class of people that depend on it, welfare, health, and the like, how do you persuade these citizens to voluntarily wind back the state even a little bit, let alone to the point of a stateless society? So what are you left with? Education.
You tell me. That's why I'm asking you. You're the man who's studied what ideas people have come up with. What do you do?
And Mises, although he was a classical liberal, it's the same problem, because where he wanted to go, even with a role for a state, was pretty radical, and he was very conscious that you had to do it by persuasion, because he had this idea that no society could survive absent majority support. So he thought any kind of society could survive. I mean, the Soviet Union survived for 70 odd years or whatever it was. I mean, the Third Reich survived for a couple of decades,
almost 2 decades,
under Hitler. So there's a panoply of different states that could potentially garner enough support. But his point was you had to persuade or shift a majority to have any hope of not only the transition, but you've also got to maintain the transition once you're in. And the libertarian, or at least the principled libertarian, doesn't have the tools that statists do of buying support through voters, dispensing largesse, using the coercive apparatus of police and intelligence. And if your opponent's being a problem, you just look at what's going on in the US. You pardon your friends, you do silly baseless law cases against your enemies, and then in places like Russia, you just kill the opponent. So none of these tools are available to the libertarians, wherever they are on the spectrum. So you're left with a multi-generational campaign of education, media, and also political action, whether it's activism in trying to get laws changed or repealed, or there are libertarian parties springing up all over the planet, seeking to unwind the state from within.
Is that from a libertarian? Well, I guess you've just answered it, in that it needs to be a case of convincing rather than coercion. But obviously, as you sort of started to allude to, that the libertarian is really fighting with both hands tied behind our backs, because we're competing against the people with the apparatus that is the monopoly of violence and coercive force, the governments. So,
and in a system where politics is about, it's a contest for control of the levers of the state to enable
Yeah.
you to write laws, change laws, repeal laws, to dispense and withdraw money and other goods and services. And that's really what it is a contest over. Yet the libertarian thinks most of that, or all of it, depending where they are on the spectrum, is wrong
Immoral.
and
Yeah.
bad. And so
Yeah.
you do have to, like, the anarcho-capitalists are interesting. There's a divide about whether it's even legitimate to participate in democratic politics, because if you think the state is corrupt, evil, and you get some pretty extreme critical views of
I
the
know.
state,
Yeah. I've seen. Yeah.
can do you become complicit by actually getting elected to a parliament? And even say in the Australian context, you're a backbencher, but you're sitting in this institution that's doing things that you regard to be unjust. So
But it
that's the
even
real
goes.
tension. There are some who think you shouldn't go into politics at all.
Yeah, but it even goes. I would have thought one step back from that is what truly libertarian-minded person is actually motivated and interested in, going into the pit of vipers
Yeah.
when the pit of vipers is exactly the thing that they want to avoid at all costs. I mean, that's how I feel about it as Liberty Itch's nomad libertarian. It's just
Yeah.
my solution is just leave. Like, why stay and fight? The collapse of, as a society moves towards socialism, the collapse is inevitable. It always has, it always will, and society needs to go through that complete collapse in order to realize the wrongs of those ways and start afresh from libertarian roots, where everyone goes, freedom's really important. Whereas at the moment, I think most Australians in particular would just be going, why would I want freedom when I can get handouts? Or,
Not only that, but part of the state ideology is freedom. So that's baked into the ideological infrastructure of Western liberal democracy. Because you got to remember, in the Cold War, we were freedom fighting against totalitarianism, and in
well,
World War II,
ostensibly, yes.
yeah. So I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily true, and of course, we have vastly more freedom than North Koreans and Iranians. So we have to acknowledge that. But I'm saying this is the challenge that the libertarian has to confront. Is you have two things which together make a really hard shell, and one is not just the benefit. So it's not just self-serving, but people are reared on a fear that chaos will reign if there's no state or a smaller state, and there'll be people dying in the streets, and there'll be no healthcare, and people will become illiterate because my goodness, who's going to educate people? But then there's also this thing of like, well, we already are free. We're the freest humans that have ever lived because we live in Western liberal democracy, and freedom is part of democracy and Western liberalism. And it's interesting because even though like you think about COVID, the state came out of the closet, excuse the
well put,
and showed what kind of power it actually has. Because what people need to realize is it didn't really do anything illegal. It used legislative powers it had on the books in all of these health acts. And people realize, particularly state governments, which are not really limited by a constitution in the way the federal government's limited, they can simply pretty much do whatever they want to do, provided they don't violate the federal constitution. They've got, I think it's called it's like a plenipotential legislative power. Like there's no issue they can't legislate on potentially. Like they could even establish a religion and do weird things people don't realize. So my point is, even that experience of COVID, where they literally had the power and could enforce it with what Mises called the apparatus of coercion and compulsion. That was his definition of the state. And still, after that, people still have the average Australian still has the thing of, well, we're free, and we are free, and the slaves are in North Korea and Iran, even though in their day-to-day life they're not locked in their homes. So it's an interesting it just shows you the power of the ideology and the positive associations they have. And so you've got libertarians trying to say people need freedom, and the presupposition is you're not free or not completely free. Yet you're competing against an ideology which is, well, in a Western liberal democracy, the very definition of that is we're free, even if we're locked in our homes against our will. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. But this, I guess that would be the thing. How would you even? We've said that Mises and libertarians generally believe in the power of persuasion over the power of coercion, and that's how you get to this libertarian ideology or closer toward it. But what is the sales pitch for the average Australian these days? Like you say, for one, they believe they're free, but what is libertarianism offering that people, Australians, because that's obviously our audience, would feel is an improvement in their quality of life over what they have right now? What's on offer there?
I think the soft underbelly of our state and its ideology right now is definitely cost of living, and economic theory is a huge part of libertarianism. And it's funny, even libertarian, basically all libertarians are amateur economists in my experience, because it's such a big focus of libertarianism, and so many of the formative, influential thinkers of libertarianism, Mises is one of them, but also Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, they've all been economists or trained in economics of one kind or another. So I think what I find most effective in at least getting people to think differently about the state is the sustainability of its growth and spending and services, for one, because you just say things like, where does the state get its money from? And it can really only get it from three sources. It either takes it from the citizens, that's called taxation and all businesses. It can print it, which means just make it out of thin air, or it can borrow it. And they all have a downside. All three of those have a severe downside, and you couldn't run a household like that indefinitely. You'd end up in prison or on the street. So there's this kind of long-term sustainability. That's one angle I find can get through to people, because there is no good answer to the sustainability question of just ever greater taxation, borrowing money and printing money. And of course that has flow-on effects in terms of inflation, and we get into complex economic arguments. But also, I might leave it there just as an opener. I guess what I'm saying is, I think because there's a relatively high degree of social freedom in Australia compared to historical societies and even societies today, it's the impact of government activity on the economy and the actual quality of life of people. You can go the regulation route, just try to explain to people how bloody hard it is to start a business and how many hoops you have to jump through and all of the compliance costs. And then you've got the taxation, and there's licensing, and there's occupational health and safety, and there's this, that, and the other, particularly for people who don't work in business. People just don't have visibility of all state activity and its impact.
That's what I'm thinking, is that it's, I think every encounter that an average person might have with a government institution that you would generally agree is a negative experience. It certainly has been in my life. The around the world, whatever is your local Department of Motor Vehicles is always held up by libertarians as a, do you really want this ruling your life? Do you want everything that you do like that? One thing I don't think, I myself was never politically interested for most of my life, because I never felt it impact my life directly. And it wasn't until that it did, and this was long before COVID, this was just setting up small business in Australia, and not just Australia, but particularly when I moved back to Melbourne to do it, and went through a living hell. And for me, COVID was the final straw of just sort of, I'm absolutely done with this. It's not just the taxation. It was also just the infuriating regulation over absolutely just the most trivial, irrelevant nonsense that you need to fill in forms and spend thousands of dollars for some person who's got a university degree, which they were then able to use to get a license, which they pay a fee to the government for this piece of paper so that they've got a stamp with a number on it. So they can stamp the piece of paper to say that they've checked that you've got the right light bulb in the bathroom. Just stupid, asinine garbage. Sorry, I'm going to get fired up. Since I've left Australia and spoken to people, around Turkey, Serbia, Georgia, Dubai, smaller countries with less government interference and apparatus, and you explain some of these things, and they're like, why would they do that? It was a transition for me to go into some of these other societies because I kept on asking, how do I apply to do that? And they're like, what do you mean apply? And it's like, well, isn't there a form I need to fill? Isn't there an agency responsible? And they're like, why would you have an agency responsible for that?
Yeah.
Even down to crossing a busy road. And they're just sort of like, if you're so stupid that you walk in front of a car and die, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
It's like, no one's going to give you a ticket for jaywalking because you're an idiot. Like, don't be an idiot.
Yeah.
And yet in Australia, it's like there's some nanny state apparatus for every single thing that you do.
There is. I think that's why the personal testimony of people like you, Damon, is so important, because I've never started a business and run a business, and there are millions of Australians who haven't. I mean, I happen to know because I'm a libertarian, but a lot of people they wouldn't believe what you just said because they've never heard it. Because so many people just put up with the system and carry on. It's just the price of doing business. And you think about it's interesting, the narrative in Australia. I was on YouTube Shorts and I don't know how this came into my feed, but I happened to get Adam Bant on, with some footage of the richest billionaires on the planet at the Donald Trump inauguration, and saying how we can and must tax these people more and all this. And just struck me that it's interesting in the left's narrative, because they focus on the richest, like 0.0 whatever percent, and they say, look, we can do everything. And he was basically promising, we can fund and do whatever we want. I'm paraphrasing, because there are these riches just sitting there in these individuals' bank accounts. Never mind they've started successful businesses and
well, never mind that the money doesn't actually sit in a bank account. It's the value of an operation that relies on their personal involvement in it.
But notice what he doesn't talk about. He doesn't.
No, he doesn't understand it. Yeah.
The millions of people who depend on small businesses, who don't have 30 lawyers and billions of capital just sitting there to be able to just outsource compliance or bear the cost. But it's the little guy, not just the owners, the people. Think about how many people work for small business owners, and then their families depend on it, and they're the ones being strangled by regulation and suffocated. And then they complain that, in capitalism, all these big businesses just rule everything. It's like, you make it so bloody difficult for anyone else to compete. Of course, you're going to end up with monopolies and the like.
But this is the what I term the Rockefeller model, which is to establish an effective monopoly in a capitalist society using regulation and the government apparatus. Because when you run the only organization that can possibly withstand the burden of that regulation, people would just go, well, why would you want that? It's like, well, I want it so I can crowd out any competitor that might want to enter the space, so that it's not possible for anyone to enter the space. I own the entire market, so I'll do any regulation you want me to do. It works in my favor.
That's a great point, Damon. People don't realize that the government plays an integral role often in these monopolies, because when you have this hugely powerful center that makes the laws, is responsible for compliance with the laws, prosecution, arrest, and has all of the officials that make all of these decisions, then what is a big, powerful business logically, rationally going to do? It's going to do everything it can to gain
To get in good
control
with
or
those
corrupt
people.
that process. And it often
Yeah,
has the means, which is why they cozy up to the ministers, and the ministers then get cushy jobs in the business
that's right.
afterwards, doing government relations, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean.
Mm.
It really means they're there for their contacts into the Labour or Liberal parties so that, again, they can get their way. And of course, the little guy, he doesn't have a
Doesn't have a
government
chance.
relations office and a former minister from cabinet who can go up and just have a quiet word to the Prime Minister and say, look, this law that's coming out, it's fine, but could we just exclude this industry, or can we leave this out? So, I mean, the point is, it
Well, it's
corrupts
more
the whole economy.
blatant. I've been in some of these meetings in a previous life, and it's not a case of that. It's a case of the government just pushes the notepad across to the head of the organization, of the large company, and says, write the regulation that you want to see overseeing your industry.
Are you serious?
I'm absolutely serious. They do the same with tender processes. It's please write the requirements of the tender. And they literally write out the requirements, which is just basically a checklist off the front page of their website, going, our particular service offers this, and this, and the tender says you need to offer this, and this, and it's just there's only one company in the world that can possibly meet the criteria for the tender, and smaller companies then waste time and resources answering to these tenders that they know they have absolutely no chance of winning. And they do it because those companies know that the only way to actually curry favor with those officials for the next tender is to answer to this one, so that the officials can go, we went to the market, we had 16 submissions, and this was the one that best met the requirements. And the whole thing was, I mean, to all intents and purposes, it was a fraud. It was a setup from the outset, a rigged game.
This is what is so insidious with that Adam Bant Green's
it's disgusting.
hatred of capitalism, because it kind of acts like the government is this thing divorced from the market, whereas the government regulates the market in Australia in all kinds of different ways. Like its involved,
and the people know each other, and it's about personalities. It's not
constantly
an
corrupts
arm's
the
length.
market. So he's not telling the full story to people. Although it's just like there are these greedy capitalists who make all this money and steal it off the people. And it's like, well, they're literally in the bed having sex with the government every night.
Yeah, that's right.
Government you want to run.
Yeah.
So,
but let's face it, the ideology of jealousy, which is what communism and socialism is, they are as much. Their jealousy is as much just wanting to see the successful, competent person crushed as they are wanting to be in power themselves.
Just
option seems to work.
Something worth mentioning, Damon, for someone who's not familiar with libertarianism and in particular anarcho-capitalism, one thing I really admire about particularly anarcho-capitalists is they are dead against corporate welfare. And so it's not that they just think big business is perfect and all this. They acknowledge that there's a lot of corruption because of this relationship between the state. And so they are against all forms of handouts and regulatory capture and sweetheart deals and all of this kind of stuff. So
well, then let's bring this back to the discussion and not just my ranting, and explain that side of things. I'm claiming that my experience is one of, the government being both effectively corrupt at its heart, and not functional or helpful in many regards as well, with the laws that it puts in place and the process and all the rest of it. What is the libertarian solution to that? How would libertarians solve that? What would libertarians do about the right light bulb being in the bathroom that requires $3,000 worth of consultancy fees and a university qualified person to get a license to inspect that light bulb every 6 months to see that it's got a certificate?
Yeah. The answer is absolutely nothing, because that just wouldn't come within the the purview of legitimate state activity. Again, the whether it's classical, I mean, anarcho-capitalists, obviously there's no state, so all of this is like illegitimate. But even for the more classical liberal school of libertarianism, if it's not about protecting health, life, and private property, then there is no role for the government there. So is that certificate on the light bulb saving people's lives? No. Is it
Well,
about protecting private property? Not really.
Well, that's perfect, because that obviously is where we get into this very grey area, and the push and the pull between the diehard, from your anarcho-capitalist all the way through to your full-on socialist. And it's that idea of serving the people, protecting the people, worrying about the community, etc., etc. Two completely polar opposite solutions. But take the light bulb in the bathroom. Who's going to stop that? Who's going to make sure that light bulb in the bathroom continues to function and keep people safe if there isn't a university qualified licensed expert to do an inspection every 6 months according to the government regulations for the bathroom light bulbs? If nobody does anything about it, how could the light bulb possibly function? Who's responsible for this light bulb?
Yeah, well, it's the individual. I mean, a big part of this, and we should introduce this into the conversation, is that the libertarian thinks individuals are actually better placed to make their own risk assessments, not the government. I mean, you think the government makes all these risk assessments. In the case of the light bulb, they're making an absurd risk assessment, which is like, I mean, checking it every 6 months. I mean, it just seems ridiculous. I mean, they're pretty safe light bulbs these days, aren't they? I mean, if they
I was being facetious about that. There wasn't really one. It was an example of an absurdity. There is actually a
I would believe it.
Oh, that's the thing. There's a legitimate one about the special bins for ladies' personal hygiene products and their disposal. And there is a company that you're supposed to register with who charges a couple of $1,000s a year to change a special bin, which is just a plastic bin that you would buy from the $2 shop.
Yeah.
And but that's the only officially authorized bin that people are allowed to dispose of women's sanitary products. And there's a fine if you don't have the appropriate. And to me, it was just like, screw you. I'm not doing it. On principle, I'm not doing it. It's a freaking bin. And it's just that case of, for me, knowingly becoming a lawbreaker because the law is just so goddamn absurd. It's like, I'm not spending $2,000 a year for a person to check a freaking plastic bin for one tampon a month.
Yeah, I know.
It's just, it's ridiculous. And
I say it sounds no different than the made-up one. That's the point, isn't it? Like at this point, I mean, what wouldn't you believe if someone said there's some new regulation? And the thing people need to understand is we pay for all of this. Like nothing the government does is for free. Everything costs money.
That's right.
And it's either funded by your taxes or through the printing of money, which then creates
inflates
inflation.
away the value of the savings that you have.
Borrow money, and then that's paid back with taxpayer money. So maybe you don't pay, but your kids do. So, I mean, that's
what I was trying
way
to get
around
at,
this. I would say to people, do you want to pay for, and then just list the absurd thing where, like, you have to pay salaries for people to do it, and there's like the whole, the administrative cost of administering it. Maybe a whole agency is set up for it. So, but just back to that point, because it's really important about the personal risk assessment. So there's a fundamental philosophical approach here that's different, I think, certainly from all of the other ideologies out there, which is people should take on more personal risk. This is how we could have got through COVID. And will that mean some more people will die? Yeah, possibly. But why are you and I responsible for someone walking along the edge of a cliff and we didn't build a fence or a sign saying, you might not know this, but if you walk off a 100-foot cliff, you might die? like at some point, personal responsibility has to come
That's
into
what
it,
I was
right?
trying to lead you towards, was
Yeah,
talking about the responsibility aspect of libertarianism. We talk about the freedom side, but on the other side of that is the responsibility side, which is what then counterbalances
yeah.
it. Um,
And
and
the fundamental problem, Damien, is that when it comes to the state helping people in need, protecting people from every perceived threat, there is no logical limit to it.
no,
So, which is why I think we've been on this 20th century and into the 21st century trajectory of the expansion of the state, because there is no coherent logical endpoint. And
no,
uh, it's like, okay, we are going to pay in Australia, we're going to subsidize your healthcare, but not when you go to the dentist. So of course the Greens want to fund dentistry, and to the Greens' credit, it's totally arbitrary. Why if you if you're going to give
yep,
people free hospital care, why make them pay for the dentist? And then if you're going to pay the dentist, why not the physio and then the aroma therapy? And then why wouldn't you pay for the counselling and the psychiatry? Or maybe psychiatry is state. I don't know. And then like it goes on and on. And so it's kind of like you look at the effort to pretty much eliminate every death and injury on our roads. And so the speed limits just keep
the
coming
speed limits keep
down,
coming. Yeah,
and the cameras keep going up. It's like, well, at some point, why don't you just ban driving? Because if, like, at some point, you become so obsessed with protecting every life that you forget to measure it
let people have a life,
with
a
other
bit like
good.
COVID.
And this was the
Yeah.
COVID balance. So
You
they
have an
thought,
existence, you don't have a life. Like, you're not saving lives, you're saving existences.
yeah,
And you weren't even saving existences either, because, well, as
yeah,
the statistics, bear out,
yeah,
there was no increase in mortality
yeah,
during the COVID period. The increase in mortality all happened after the medication was rolled out, with the
yeah,
15% increases across the board everywhere. The average age of COVID death, even though, as was acknowledged a few times by some of the people, around 90% of the COVID deaths weren't from COVID, they were with COVID. So
yeah,
you had those ridiculous cases of the person who got hit by a bus and died with COVID, counted as a COVID death, and such things. When Italy was the first country to have the really, really bad situation, that happened to be in a part of Italy that had the oldest population in Europe, that had gone through a pneumonia pandemic just the less than a year beforehand,
mhm,
had the worst air quality in Europe. It was like this confluence of factors that
yeah.
is just so utterly unique to this province. And they went, look at all the people who died, and it's just like, well, yeah, but that's got nothing to do with anyway. I won't get onto the
But see,
deadly virus
I
thing.
think COVID revealed a particular
The
mentality of the
absurdities.
state ideology, and here I'm talking particularly of those who work for the state, and it's like
Yes.
they see their role as protecting life in a kind of um, strange way, not the way I meant before, when like libertarians actually believe in protecting life as well. So in COVID, given the profile of morbidity, so I think the average age of COVID death in Australia was like well over 80,
Yeah,
right?
it was. I think it was 83 or 84, and the life expectancy is 82. It was actually
Yeah.
older than
So
the
we
standard life
lock.
expectancy.
So this is what I mean. How that you lose perspective when you think this is the role of the state. So it's like, okay, let's screw up the entire education of a couple of million kids, right? And
Mm,
you, like
yeah,
me, may know lots. Suicides, people dropping out of school,
yeah. I had several people I
never
knew.
really recovering. I know many
Yeah,
stories. I had a kid in primary school who just checked out of school altogether because the homeschooling was a joke. But anyway, um, so and I could say a lot more about the cost imposed on people, but this is a really clear cut one. So our youngest kids, the future of our society,
Yeah.
We screw them up, their education, their psychology, so that the 90-year-old can live another 6 months of natural life before naturally dying. Like, it makes no, like, I know it
Never
sounds
did.
callous, but these people are supposed to make these
Yeah,
big.
but it never did make sense, and it,
So they
these
just didn't
discussions have
get.
been.
They didn't get the
Yeah.
balance. Like, it's so bizarre when you think it, when you look back, and it's like, we had to make sure people in the nursing home didn't die from COVID, but just died from pneumonia and all the other things that they die of every day.
Yeah,
And
because
in order to achieve that, we're going to stop a 20-year-old, visiting their dying friend in hospital, or we're going to
more the
stop
point
kids
that
from going to school.
the people who were dying were the old people in aged care. These were people who they weren't in retirement villages. They were in aged care. They were,
You're in end of life.
God's waiting room, as they call aged care. It's like you're seeing out your last days. The last thing any of them want to, the only thing any of them want to do is to spend as much time with their family as they possibly can.
Yeah.
And what did? They stole that from them. The callousness and cruelty of what they did to every part of society in COVID is absolutely disgusting. And I would have,
all
you
they
would
had
have
to do
thought
was let people make their own risk assessments.
make their own. Yeah, exactly.
A certain percentage would have worn masks, would have changed their habits because maybe they wanted to visit grandma in the nursing home. But meanwhile,
if grandma knew she was checking out very, very soon, anyways, it would be like, I don't care. I just want to see my grandchildren for the last time to say goodbye.
Yeah.
None of this. You're not allowed to cross the border, and you got to do it over a Zoom call or something. It's just, it was grotesque. And how these people can maintain their positions and everyone can be okay with it. It's just,
I think as well, people are so inured to the state just introducing ever more layers of regulation and control that they don't question it. What I mean by that is they just assume there must be a good reason for it. So I'll give you a bugbear of mine living in Canberra, the ACT. So, and I've been here.
One of many. There's only one bugbear of yours there? Or?
Oh, well, no.
One of many.
Yeah. Just say, it sounds like a trivial point, but it's in the trivial where you see the absurdity of the state control and power. So, I mean, we have one of the safest, we have one of the lowest death rates from road accidents, understandably, small population, but it's often like under 10 a year, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
In saying that. And yet, in the 20 plus years I've been here, the speed limits just keep coming down ever and ever more. Yeah. And in Civic, which is what we call the CBD, they have now taken it down to 40. And of course, everyone thinks, okay, yes, it makes us safer. But I'm like, okay, I want to know how many people have died in Civic, pedestrians and drivers from road accidents. And it's zero. Yeah. That's not where the accidents are.
Yeah.
And they set up speed cameras all over the city. So in the first months, they raised a record amount of money because people didn't notice that it had gone down to 40. So I'm like, okay, so we get fined because it's bloody hard to go 40 in a city, and Canberra's roads flow like it's not bumper to bumper. You can.
I was going to say there's no traffic on the roads in Canberra, so it's not. So
I'm like,
most of the time,
show me the epidemic of pedestrians and drivers dying in Civic in the CBD to justify going from 60 to 50 and now 50 to 40 and setting up speed cameras everywhere. And I'm like, this is what I say to people. Have you asked what the rationale for this is? Where's the evidence? Because if there are no deaths there, then it's just the money-making exercise. How can you not be cynical? Because you're going to get a lot more fines when the speed limit's 40, I can tell you.
Yeah, it gets and it gets a whole lot worse when you talk to somebody in Macquarie Bank and you find out exactly where the money for all of those fines actually goes and how the cameras are funded. And
the fines keep going up. They keep putting the fines up all the time.
Yeah, but it's not going to the it's not all going to the government.
It's just one little example of the other one is there are just like speed humps everywhere. And it's like, why? It's ruining my car. Like, what's the problem this is supposed to solve that my taxpayer dollars have to build literally speed humps Like, I can't see how many speed humps there are in Canberra now. They're literally, there'll be a speed hump in every single street before you know it. It's just weird.
But here's the extension to that. It's like you look at the mileage in your car when you do only city driving versus going out into the country and doing a drive. You'll literally drive in a modern car 3 times further when you can just sit at a speed and cruise along forever and ever and ever versus stop start. So what do we see? More traffic lights, terribly sequenced. The sequencing's terribly. You just get stopped by light after light after light after light on a straight road. Speed humps. Everything is braking, accelerating, braking, accelerating. They go on and on about we need to save the environment and we need car manufacturers to increase their efficiency. Meanwhile, they're putting in these traffic lights and speed humps to make the actual driving process as maximally inefficient as a vehicle could possibly operate, as well as making drivers more irate and more likely to have accidents. I've never had an accident in my life, touch wood, and yet I've never come closer to having accidents than when they drop the speed limits in Melbourne to 40 kilometers per hour. It's like, how do you concentrate on the road when you're going walking speed? It's impossibly difficult.
That absurd zero tolerance thing that was brought in Victoria.
It's insane. Yeah.
Like when you come from like the ACT in New South Wales, which you've got to drive through to get to Melbourne, where you can go 10% over the speed limit. That's generally the unspoken rule. I've never had a speeding ticket in Canberra, and I don't drive the speed limit. I mean, the cameras are different, and I've gone past plenty of cops, and you get to the Victorian border, and I'm not looking at the road. I have to. I'm
constantly looking at the speedo.
In the city.
Yep.
I feel like I'm going to crash every second because I've got to watch the bloody.
I totally agree.
The road. Yeah. Because
what? Yep. I was living in
the universe. Do you not at least allow people a couple of Ks over? Because have these people ever driven a car? Like you can't be on cruise control in the city. So it's to the speed limit.
It's crazy. I was living in Queensland, and in 7 years I had 1 traffic infringement. 7 years, 1 traffic infringement. Came back to Melbourne, 11 infringements in 11 months. Then had to do some dodgies with friends to get some extra points where they took the ticket for me, and then lost my license in 13 months. I didn't change my driving. I didn't have an accident. I didn't drive dangerously or anything else. It was just cameras, police. I got pulled over in a brand new BMW. So, not a hotted up Hoonmobile or anything else like this. Brand new BMW with some new personalized plates that I'd put on it. And the cops pulled me over, sirens wailing, pulled me out of traffic. It's like, what the hell is going on? Where did you get that license plate from? It's like, the hell are you? Where do you buy license plates from? I went online. I typed in the thing. I paid the extortionate amount of money. And they're just like, but did you tell us that you were putting it on the car? It's like, what the hell else would I do with a license plate? Like, I had to tell you the vehicle identification number, the current license number, my driver's license number, all of this data all went into your system. What the hell are you pulling me over for? And they wanted to fine me for putting a Victorian plate on a Victorian brand new car driving at the speed limit, not brake. It's just... Yeah, and you just, to hell with this. It's just a mafia state now. Anyway,
this
we're probably getting off topic, aren't we?
No, but I think the underlying point here is, like you and I, because we have been awoken to the reality of the state. We could just literally go for 10 hours citing example after example of idiotic rules, scams that the state pulls, acts of a needless, pointless aggression, and
let's not forget the failures and the wastage that.
Oh yeah, and it's a matter. There is a way here to educate people. It's just it is a kind of slow process, which is why initiatives like this podcast are so needed. To be honest. Because you take people through and you say, why is the speed limit 40? Like, have you ever thought about it? What's the reason? Like, did deaths go up at 50?
Well, even more
What difference
interestingly,
does it
there,
make?
yeah, my understanding is when speed limits were originally set, it was not an arbitrary process. It was actually a case of doing tests on the roads and going, what is the average speed that people tend to drive on this road? Because again, we recognize this as libertarians. You just go, for the most part, people don't want to harm each other. When I'm driving on the street, I don't want to crash my car. I don't want to crash your car. I don't want to have an accident with anybody. I'll drive at the speed that is reasonable for the conditions. And most people do that.
Yeah.
And the speed limits, as I understand it, were originally set by what I believe it was about 85% of people tended to drive on that stretch of road because it seemed like the reasonable speed to the average person.
Because they had the crazy idea that the people who actually use the road might have a good idea of what the safe speed is.
Of what the safe speed is, yeah. And that's the thing that I've always thought about in Melbourne with the crazy speed limits is that you go, when it's really, really busy and there is a chance of accidents and all the rest of it, the speed limit is less than 40 because you just can't move any faster than that. And you slow down when there's more traffic, or if there's people crossing the road, you instinctively slow down your car so that you're ready to stop. But when there's full visibility on a full lit street and there's not another car in sight and there's no trams and no people and you can see that, well, you might drive 60 because it's just reasonable. You've got full visibility and it's the speed that seems reasonable at the time.
Yeah,
but they don't. The government doesn't allow for that. It's like you've got to be put in a box.
Yeah, I mean, we just don't trust people to exercise that kind of judgment. And everyone is treated as untrustworthy. This was the lesson for COVID for me. The government's message was, we cannot trust you to take precautions without us coercing you.
It's very much that way, yeah.
And
I know personally for a fact, government employees, shall we say, who will verbalize that exact opinion. It's the problem is the people. And they cannot be trusted. And we need to do this to stop people from being the criminals that they inherently and intrinsically are.
Yeah. And you know the word for that? Authoritarianism. That's an authoritarian mindset. Like it honestly is. And I think the terrible upshot of all this is that it infantilizes people. And so you rob people of the ability to actually become mature, adult, functioning people who can assess risk, make decisions, learn from their mistakes, because you're not allowed to even make a mistake anymore, and to allow individuality, because it's like
100%.
Imagine speed limits were removed in a city, because I take your point, like you can't actually go that fast.
That's right. Yeah,
conditions.
You can't drive 120 kilometers an hour through Sydney CBD at 6 p.m. on a Monday night. You can't do it if you wanted to. There is literally.
So there's an interesting thought experiment here, and I like to do this with people, and I say, because they just cannot conceive of a world where that wouldn't lead to some kind of apocalyptic scenario. And I said, like honestly, what would happen? Would you start going 20 to 50k over the speed limit everywhere? No, of course I wouldn't drive that. Well, who is? Oh, well, there will be people who do it. I said, there are people who do it now, even though they're the people who are already speeding. The people who are going to speed are already speeding, and maybe on certain roads you'll go a bit faster. But I mean, is everyone literally going to turn into some hoon that's like burning around corners? Like
that's right.
Just honestly, what is the likelihood that like literally everyone's just crashing because suddenly no one can drive normally? But of course, people just can't conceive of that, And I mean, it's just one example, and you could do the same thing with like that example of the the bin for female sanitary products or whatever they're called. I mean, what would happen?
Yeah, not a damn thing. Yeah.
You didn't have to pay that one company. What if you could just buy a bin from Bunnings and stick that in your business and say, put sanitary products or whatever the message. Like, honestly, what happens? I can't think of anything.
Not a damn thing. Yeah, that's exactly the point.
I mean,
But
we've harped on a couple of points, but like I say, we could go 10 hours just listening to things. And I just think it's about forcing. It's just putting the question to people, and they will see it themselves, because they can't answer the question of why we need this particular law or regulation, and why the sky would collapse if we got rid of something.
Yeah, but this is sort of the point, going back to what is the benefit for the average person in Australia, because obviously we can't get, as libertarians, we can't get to where we want to get to, where we do have more personal freedom again, unless we can convince our fellow Australians that it's a good thing, that they could use some more freedom in their life as well, and a few less regulations. The unintended consequences of regulation and unfettered government interference into society must be a topic that is often spoken about in the literature by libertarians. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And for example, because we're sort of talking about it before, but free healthcare has always struck me as a difficult nut to crack, in that
that's the holy grail in Australia, where all libertarianism goes to die at the moment you suggest.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't have free healthcare, or even if you just.
Well,
look what happened when Tony Abbott wanted to just put a very modest price signal on GP visits. It was almost
but that's even a different thing, though, because it's the issue is there's a I don't know how to describe it. There's a cavalier attitude by a certain cohort of Australians, whereby they feel it's their right to be repaired for any of the damage they inflict upon themselves through their own known stupidity.
Yeah.
And they will behave knowingly irresponsibly and highly recklessly with the known safety net that it doesn't matter. Yeah. If I crash into a tree in the car while I'm stoned off of my head, well, it's my right that I will be fixed for free and made whole again. And if I'm left crippled for the rest of my life, well, they owe it to me to look after me for the rest of time. So why would I have any personal responsibility when the state has already offered me that it will take responsibility for me?
So state healthcare actually provides a perverse incentive against being healthy.
Exactly. Yes.
That's what you're saying. And it's funny. I had this conversation with someone just a couple of days ago in a cafe, actually.
Yeah.
And I was doing exactly what I've been telling you we should do, and we're doing in the podcast. And I said, what do you think would happen if we no longer had free healthcare? And I said, look, we can't be absolutely certain, because it hasn't happened. But I'll tell you one thing, people will become healthier, because you're now
incentivized to.
What's the rational thing to do? You're going to work out, you're going to stop smoking, you're not going to drink a lot, because you can't afford the risk of the cost if you actually have to pay the true cost of your health decisions. And it was like, oh, no, it's not going to happen. I'm not saying everyone will do it, but there has to be some boost in health, because there are enough rational actors out there who are going to see, and parents are going to, they might feed their kids a different diet, because you do not want that hospital bill and the like. And then, what are the other benefits? Well, it means the healthy people stop subsidizing the unhealthy through their tax funds. You basically pay for what you need. Now, there are counter arguments, because some health things are genetic and they're beyond your control, obviously, and some of those.
But that comes back to, is that my responsibility that you've got a genetic defect?
This is the
and what's a genetic defect? Because they're trying to say that obese people are have a genetic problem. Nobody in Somalia has this particular genetic problem, but in America and places where there's a lot of processed American branded food, there seems to be a lot of this genetic predisposition to becoming very, very fat. But all the countries where there isn't the same terrible quality of food, suddenly the supposed genetic disposition doesn't exist anymore. That's
I think in a genuinely libertarian society, welfare disappears, but what you have in its place is charity, because charity is not welfare. If I want to voluntarily give money for your liver transplant, indeed, if I want to give you a kidney, I'm free to do that. We already have charity.
And you'd be able to and motivated to, because you're not being taxed into oblivion, so you actually have some resources to do that.
Not only that, but you get what you don't get now, which is some control over where you want to invest your charity. Whereas now, I mean, this is another thing. You say to people, well, you pay taxes, right? Yes. Well, I'm happy to pay taxes to help out. Right. Do you know what your tax dollars are being used, and do you get to approve it? Well, I said, you got no, like the money's taken and then it's used and spent by others, and you don't really get any say. I mean, you get to vote for your local member, and there's like a 1% of the policies get debated during an election, and most of what happens isn't even covered.
Don't even know.
But even like, you just say to people, and I'm not saying, by the way, there are no arguments here. I mean, you shouldn't be arrogant as an
not at all. Yeah, it's complicated.
You've got to justify these, and also I think the libertarian needs to be honest and acknowledge there are downsides. You know, some of these policies will generate more problems, but I think they're better problems to have than what we have right now, and it's just important to be honest about that. But as I think Mises said, like it's not a debate between perfection and imperfection. Like we all know what human life consists of, and perfection is not what's in the picture. But like, I even say to people, because you know, Elon Musk is just a triggering name these days for anyone on the left, right? And you know, richest guy in the world. Although he says Putin's the richest guy in the world, he might be right about that, but he's not on the official books, and we don't know exactly how much he has. But saying that aside, okay, so Adam Bant wants to take $100 billion out of his pocket. Okay, you say to people, what is the moral justification for doing that? Because Musk doesn't want to give up the money. You know, he's generated it by starting multiple companies, successful companies. They hire tens of thousands of people and then all of their family members. Like, he's generated a lot of good stuff, but why does being a multi-billionaire mean we can take your money and not off a poor person? What's the difference from the street criminal who takes your wallet against your will and the government taking $1 billion from Elon Musk? Like, what makes one theft and the other one something else? And what gives you a right, it's not your money, to say, yeah, that's good, I want the government to go and take more money? That's the Greens line. They want to take money from these people and then redistribute it to these people over here. And I just wish there was more honesty about that. Like I say, there are arguments you can make for that, but there's this great pretense that it's not what it is, which is forcibly taking property off one person and then giving it to another, otherwise known as theft. And
but I personally, I think it goes even worse than that. I admired Steve Jobs when he was alive, and one of the things that he said about Apple was in terms of, you know, philanthropy and et cetera, et cetera. And he's saying the most I forget the exact words, so I'm paraphrasing again, but something to the effect of, I honestly, truly believe that the very best thing I can do with any money that I could have to invest in any group of people to help them out as much as possible is keep it in Apple. It's the best way he knew to make even more money that winds up in more sales tax and more revenue and more jobs and more of everything that feeds all of society, was to keep all of that money inside Apple. So one of these arguments, like Adam Bant, is, let's take Elon Musk, let's strip mine him of everything that he has and toss it to the people who are unable or unwilling to build wealth or do anything with it themselves. And what then? Because you've just stripped mined the guy who is producing stuff that will produce revenues for years and years and years to come for tens and tens of thousands of people across all sorts of different industries and groups, whether it's trucking companies using Tesla trucks to actually transport things, whether it's people driving to and from work, taxi drive, whatever it happens to be. All the technologies used everywhere that come from his mind and are then turned into reality, that none of those people that you want to... So you've just taken the future development of everything that could come out of he and his companies, and you've just burnt the whole damn lot. So what do you do tomorrow? It's, and that goes... another example of that was what happened years ago with... Do you remember the Live Aid concerts back in, I think it was the 80s?
Oh, yeah. Bob Geldof and the likes.
Bob Geldof and Bono and all of the guys, and they sent all of the money off to Africa. I think it was Ethiopia, wasn't it? Was the country at the time. And you look up what happened after that. It put the farmers out of business, because all of the free food that was coming in from the aid competed with the produce of the farmers in Ethiopia, who couldn't compete. So they didn't get the money that they needed to then purchase fertilizers and seeds and everything that they need to make the next years of crops. They were worse off for years and years and years after Live Aid. It was all the best of intentions to help people out, and actually they inadvertently screwed people over, which is, that's... As a libertarian, we're seen as callous and uncaring and all the rest of it, but it's a big picture thinking of just going, no, you just get out of the way. And actually, human beings, we are social animals. We need to work together in order to achieve our own personal goals. We're not combative. We're not wanting to steal with each other because it doesn't serve our own interests. Very Ayn Randish argument of just selfishness is a virtue.
I mean, it all comes back to the fact that a lot of people mistakenly believe that the scope of government action has no natural limit and no cost.
Yes, and no cost, I think, is the big
opposite.
one.
Every government action has a cost.
Massive.
And the more the limit is extended, the greater the cost. And I think you can... It's a problem of scale, because I find you can definitely change the way people think in one-on-one conversations. But particularly in Australia, where libertarianism, it's not like America, where libertarianism isn't sort of part of the natural soil of... It's not one of the ideological currents that is kind of there from the founding, or at least that's the way American libertarians tell it, with some warrant that kind of free spirit. Liberty is a big concept in America. It's not part of the political vocabulary in Australia.
The word freedom's in the first line of the Constitution, so you would say that.
I mean, we're one of the most statist free countries there is, and it's got to do with the nature of our settlement. I mean, we were settled by a government. It was a government project.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, talk about an unlibertarian founding. They send people for victimless crimes often, right? Like, or even if it's theft, like a loaf of bread, to be sent to the other side of the planet, to be a settler guarded by Marines on land that's already inhabited. Like, it's almost like the anti-libertarian story. So we have a greater challenge than virtually any other Western liberal democracy, because we have this Leviathan state ideology. It's baked into our history, where the government does everything. It's the major player, service provider, carer, protector. And you can shake people out of that, because you just ask the simple questions and they cannot answer them because there's no rational answer. But how do you get that message out when the political and also the ideological train is captured by status? I mean, the coalition and Labor, it's just a contest for who, like I said earlier, who gets to have control of the cookie jar and can hand out the cookies.
That's right. Yeah, that's what Canelm said.
They hand them to different people. They have different supporters who,
Yeah, socialist versus conservative, they're still authoritarian. It's just what they're authoritarian about. It's just the priorities of the of one side versus the other.
I mean, what could be more statist by our supposedly right-wing party than building and running state-funded and owned nuclear power plants for billions of dollars? I mean, it's a strange. I mean, I'm all in favor of nuclear power. That's you talk about government absurdities. I mean, why is it banned in Australia? Just seems like it's such an arbitrary.
It just seems like such an own goal, seeing as we've got some of the richest uranium deposits in the world.
But because we missed the boat, now the solution is the taxpayers have to build it, and operate it, and allegedly it'll be sold one day, just like the NBN, which is a load of BS.
And everyone surely knows it.
But that is the Australian way. See, even our right-wing party.
It is.
Malcolm Turnbull did Snowy Hydro 0.20. It's all about, like, the government's there to build infrastructure. That's what the Australian government does. Big projects, multi-billion-dollar projects.
But then for a libertarian-minded person like myself, my solution was, I don't believe that the population can be convinced. It's so entrenched. Mm-hmm. It's so often that every problem that arises in Australia seems to come with the answer or complaint of people that the government needs to do something about it. There's never even a second thought about doing something about it yourself or any other way around a problem other than government doing it.
Yeah.
So this comes back to does this come from the colonialization of Australia with criminals? Is that the root cause of why Australia is like this? Because that's a lot of generations back now that happened, and I understand that it rolls through from generation to generation.
But in a way, it's the opposite founding to America, where it's people fleeing persecution by the state because they have a heretical faith, or they want economic opportunity, and so they go to the new England or the new territory. Australia is settled by the state. It's like a bureaucratic thing of, like, we've got excess prisoners. Where do we send them? So the whole thing is, as far as I'm aware, is funded by the state. It's not a private enterprise. Sure, free settlers start coming later, but also because of the nature of the settlement, the government basically runs everything early on. And so it starts a pattern that's quite different from the American
it's self-perpetuating
founding. And of course, you don't want to try and explain everything just through this lens. But I do think, this is not my original idea. This is this is a common story here on the right in Australia, a common observation that some conservative historians have made, and I find it quite compelling and convincing that we were just set on a path. We were a government project from the beginning, and we've remained ever since. That's the Australian way.
Fascinating.
You look at COVID. We excelled at covert authoritarianism, and I think a lot of Australians were shocked. But that is the Australian way. I wasn't shocked, actually, in a certain way. And
really,
the majority of people trusted government and said, well, if they're telling me I have to do this, that, and the other, government knows best. And really, this is a common libertarian idea. I mean, you've given up your judgment and autonomy as a thinking human being to government, and government gets it wrong far too often. This is why I say the mindset change has to be, give me a bloody good reason why this new regulation is necessary, because one's almost never given. The government can just assume that people trust whatever it does is necessary.
But how often do you find Australians who care, like beyond this was the same with COVID, and some people have described it as a mass hysteria, which does explain the irrational behavior and belief in the boogeyman that didn't exist. But the other is just that faith in government, that blind faith that, well, they wouldn't be doing it unless there was a legitimate issue that needed this particular solution. I'm sure they know what they're doing. Seemed to be, to me, the response from most Australians.
I agree, but I do think the first crack appeared in the dam
Oh,
of the
100%.
state
Yeah.
ideology, and so a freedom movement emerged, and I think part of that freedom movement has gone libertarian and embraced the whole notion of libertarianism, the label. No, the Libertarian Party ranks grew in Australia out of COVID. Other parts of that freedom movement are more conservative and have gone in different directions. It's kind of splintered and gone all over the place. And but definitely, there's now a freedom constituency in Australia where there wasn't one before. But we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. It's still a minor perspective in Australia, but that's a positive start.
Which also, though, that brings us kind of back around to what we started talking about before I probably derailed us, which in terms of getting to a point where there is an increasing appreciation and acceptance of more libertarian ideas that actually leads to a reduction in government and a reduction in the interference of the state apparatus in Australia. Again, firstly, it's how do you motivate a person who's disinterested in the state to get involved in the state? And then the second one is how do you get a group of people to actually agree when actually maybe before I ask this question, in terms of the academic theory around this, surely one of the issues with libertarianism or freedom, if it's about free choice, choice is the, correct me if I'm wrong, the crucial part of the equation. I was trying to think of a more eloquent way of putting that, but it's all about choice, which means my choices are going to be different to your choices, are going to be different to the next person's choice. We can agree on the freedom of choice conceptually being our main essential point, and the removal of the state. But isn't there always going to be infighting and clashing simply because by the very nature of everybody needing to respect everybody else having free choice, those choices mean...
Yeah.
You understand the question I'm trying to get at?
It's like
paradoxical.
Is a libertarian political party a contradiction in terms, given the individualism
Essentially, yeah.
of libertarians? But the thing is to go back to the definition I began with. There are a core set of principles that
Yes.
do have a consensus in libertarianism. They're constitutive of what libertarianism means. So there is that is enough to enable libertarians to cohere, and they might not agree on every single specific policy once we get down into the detail, but they all have a shared direction they would like to see society and the country go. And all politics involves compromise. Like, libertarians are not revolutionaries either, in a naive sense of we think the people are going to rise up tomorrow, or even think that it would necessarily be a good thing to simply snap your fingers and the state disappears. You need a process to transition people, businesses, institutions, and the like. You can't just get rid of state schools tomorrow. It'll take a while for other arrangements to come into the picture. And even if you had more freedom on, let's say you had completely free curricula at state or local level or school level even, people need time to generate a curriculum. So there's enough of a shared broad agenda, and as for libertarians to work together whilst having some interesting disagreements along the way. Is an interesting way of, and this is not my idea, and I can't remember where I first read this, or maybe someone told me I was talking to in Australia, but if you take the ultimate ideal society endpoint of the anarcho-capitalist and that of the classical liberal, which does not go as far as the anarcho-capitalist, well, from where we are today,
it's a long way to even
start. The next 90% of the road is identical, right?
Yes, that's right.
So of course, this is the explanation of how they can work together in something like a libertarian party, because we are a long way off from where their really core disagreements are. They both,
Yes. Yes.
like the
Yeah.
Misesian minarchist state, is way closer to the stateless society that anarcho-capitalist wants than the one we're in. So that really is a good way, I think, of articulating why all
Yeah.
libertarians,
That is good.
where we
Yeah.
are
That makes
today,
sense.
have a shared project of rolling back the state, empowering people. Because the thing is that the thing people have to understand as well is that every time the state encroaches or expands its territory, it comes at the expense of civil society. That's then less work that voluntary associations do.
Yes.
And you know what happened when the state was smaller? Religious institutions, clubs, um, various voluntary associations, temporary,
Community
long-standing,
groups of all sorts.
did
Yeah.
all kinds of social activities, welfare
Yeah.
support. Even unions did a lot more. They were in the welfare business back in the 19th century, prior to the
Okay.
welfare state, where workers chipped in. And I mean, a union can be a voluntary association too, which libertarians forget sometimes. It's just they like to use coercion, which is
Yeah, very,
for
especially in Melbourne.
as a friend I worked with, I had a career in the public service before I became a libertarian. And I worked with this guy, and he's like, oh, well, I first did a trade. And on my first day in the trade, I can't remember, carpentry or something, guy says, you need to join the union. And he said, oh, I don't want to join the union. Next day, he was beaten up by that
Yeah.
guy
Wow.
and the others. And then he joined the union. This was a guy my age, and now in his 40s. So I'm not saying, unions are fine if they operate in a libertarian way, but they often don't do that. They also act more like mafia. I'm sorry to
They
say,
often are mafia.
violence,
Yeah.
coercion, and
Yeah.
and they become protection rackets that are about protecting their own.
Yeah.
But of course, see, in a libertarian paradise, you wouldn't have all of these labor laws, so the employer could just fire them all, or bring in scabs,
Bring in different people. Yeah.
which then would balance the equation in terms so that yeah, you could have collective bargaining, but they can't grab the business by the balls and squeeze in a way, because there are all kinds of industrial laws that prevent that enable the unions, give them measures that they wouldn't naturally have in a free market, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the funniest thing too.
Anyway, that's a digression.
It is a bit of a digression. Yeah. So actually, from that though, this 90% road that we're talking about going down before we get to the disagreements at the end, what are some suggestions of, in Australia, where we might start? What would some libertarian and I don't mean the Libertarian Party priorities, but from yourself, and if there are any general theoretical rules as to where you would start, what are the first things that libertarians would dismantle in the current state apparatus to get headed down that road?
Well, the answer is going to be different because every libertarian is passionate about something different. So some want greater freedom in education. Others want to abolish the Reserve Bank. There are others who want to do this, that, or the other. I think the place I would start is I would take a knife to all those small little regulations that I think hurt small business, SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, because I think that's where the job growth is. That's where the competition is going to come from. And I would basically make it extremely easy to start a business.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just think the impact of that is going to be massive. And I'm not talking about keep the regulations I just get rid of, if the regulation makes no sense for a small business, it's going to make no sense for a big business too. But the focus here is in enabling
So deregulation as a single word that people might recognize for it.
Yeah.
Would
Yeah,
that
because like
characterize it?
because you're not the first business owner to tell me how difficult it is in Australia. So I know a lot of people don't know, but I mean, I've known for quite a while because I'm inquisitive, so I always ask people about the rigmarole they have to go through and just the costs of doing business in Australia. Um,
And
and
setting up a
again,
business. Yeah.
yeah, like a multinational that's worth billions can absorb an enormous amount of costs, but a smaller
Mm.
business can't. You know, someone
No.
running a shop or a franchisee or someone
Yeah.
just and you want entrepreneurs and innovation, right? Because we'll be left behind if we don't compete because it's just impossible to start a business here. Our best talent will go overseas, present company included, right? Because it's just
Exactly.
an inhospitable place. So we will lose a lot of entrepreneurs. They're the people who generate jobs. I mean, where do people think jobs come from? Apart from government jobs,
Yeah.
an investor or investors have to invest money, and someone has to put the time and labor into and the risk of creating a product or service and selling it. And it only succeeds if there's a demand and the customers are satisfied with it. But when it works, lots of jobs are created, and people, the consumers benefit who are buying the product. And
Yeah.
that's what I hate about the people like Adam Bant. Like I'm like, I want to sit down with him and I want to go through his life and see if he truly lives without giving a single cent or using a single product from all of these big bad capitalists. That
Oh, I thought you were
he,
going to say you want to find out what traumatic event turned him into just such a nasty and stupid person. But
well,
yeah.
no, I wasn't good. I wasn't thinking so much
Sorry.
of that, but it's like, um, like I just hate the lack of honesty. So,
Yeah, me too.
people go on about Amazon. I'm like, it's the greatest business I've ever used because if there's any product I need, you're like this. I ran out of my protein powder,
Hmm.
so I just go on Amazon, and it's going to arrive tomorrow morning. I'm like,
Yeah.
how is this not freaking amazing? Like I know,
Yeah.
okay, it's kind of like a monopoly, yeah, because it's so damn good because you can get whatever you want and it gets delivered. I mean, I subscribe to
Unfortunately.
them, and it's like, has Adam Bant ever used Amazon and how convenient? Like, does he realize there's this thing called consumers, and they're Australians too, and something Donald Trump is going to learn once he slaps tariffs on everything that we have to buy things to live, right? And if you make them super expensive or the quality is really shitty, then the consumers are hurt. That's mums and dads. It's poor people, rich people. Poor people eat
Yeah.
food as well. They wear clothes. Everyone consumes. Uh, so it's just the whole thing is so corrupt in terms of the way we look at it. So we're a society. We are literally in the matrix. We don't see reality. We can't see the reality we were in. We're in this kind of virtual reality, and there are all these lies around us, and we literally just don't see them. But man, I don't know how long you've been a libertarian and how you got there, but when you wake up, it is like Neo being pulled out and pulling the bloody cord out, and like suddenly seeing the reality in, and then you can't unsee it. You see all of the contradictions, the hypocrisy, the absurdities, and then suddenly you realize it's like everywhere.
What was your background? So get me to that as well. Like, where did you
Um,
come from that you had the epiphany and then you developed into liking anarcho-capitalism? Let's go back a bit first.
well, I'm wondering if I should do it the other way around because it's
Okay, sure. Yeah.
because that other question's a bit more complicated actually.
Okay.
But so I like the anarcho-capitalist vision. In my mind, theoretically, I can see it working really well, but I don't think it's feasible within the material existence of human beings on this planet, because I don't think it will ever be possible to persuade a majority of people to do it. And if the people really if the people have, the society has to really believe in it for it to work, actually.
Yes.
And also, I think it's anthropology is a little too optimistic. So I'm just not sure everything can really be done in the way as anticipated without a state. So I'm just not quite. I think human beings are much more trustworthy than our current status ideology allows for. But there are still psychopaths
Yes.
and people who aren't going to suddenly become angels just because the state disappears. And
Yeah.
it goes, we talked about personal risk. So it's a risk factor, because once you get rid of the state, it's gone, right? I think I can see lots of positive benefits for it. And because of the nature of the state, I would prefer it wasn't needed.
Yes.
But it feels like a big risk to me, a greater risk than true believers in anarcho capitalism. But I don't think we'll ever get there anyway. In which case,
realistically
classical
speaking,
liberalism the step before. And Mises's logic is, he's got this. It's very Weberian, and he knew Max Weber. They were contemporaries. Max Weber was a little older, but they corresponded and were in that same kind of German-speaking milieu. Weber German and Mises Austrian. But he said, look, he believed someone had to monopolize violence. You couldn't, because human beings do have a propensity to violence. And I mean, we live in a world where there's plenty of violence. I do think states are the most violent, because when they go to war, they do it on an industrial scale that private citizens just can't wreak that kind of destruction, or even voluntary association.
It's democide, isn't it? And democide has killed more people than all of the murderers and serial killers in the history of mankind.
So he thought his rationale was, and I find this less risky in a way than the, although it's not perfect, was you needed some state entity to monopolize violence and take it away from private individuals. Otherwise, you get revenge, because you've got to have someone to arrest the murderer. And I know in the anarcho-capitalist thing, they're going to be these private security companies. I could see that working. I don't know how the private legal thing works. That hasn't really been worked out, like the actual courts, because if there are multiple courts and you sign up, how do you force? Anyway, forgetting about that. But he thought that was risky. He understood that was risky, which is why you made the state tiny, so that it really wasn't powerful enough to do much than deal with the murderers and the antisocial elements who would threaten the social cooperation that the market and prosperity depended on. And he also, and this, I don't want to weigh into this is something I'm still thinking through. He was massive on free trade, because he thought free trade led to peace, and he wanted the borders of states to become pretty meaningless. He wanted the free flow of labor. He wanted every part of the world fully integrated in the global economy, because with weak governments, because then it would make warfare impossible. This is a guy that fought in World War I, had to flee Europe because he was Jewish during World War II. So what drove his thinking was trying to realize peace in the world where states went to war. So to me, like I say, as a political philosopher, you're always weighing imperfect options against imperfect options, and you've got to make a judgment. So there's a risk in having a state with a police function. There's a risk in having no state. So on balance, I think in practice, because of human nature and because of what is actually feasible, I think a classical liberal small state will probably never get to Mises's level of small state. But I think that's an easier sell for people to say, well, there will be some body that's funded. It won't. Mises thought, and he's probably right, it wouldn't be much taxation required to
for a minimal state.
There's not. He assumed there'd be no welfare. Health wouldn't be public. Probably naively thought you wouldn't need big militaries. So in any event, that's why I say anarcho-capitalist in theory, because I do buy the anarcho-capitalist critique of the state, and I think a stateless world would be great, but maybe that's more like a heaven paradise situation. So in practice, I think we probably need some kind of state there to deal with serious crime, and maybe even to have some market functions dealing with fraud. Mises thought fraud was a legitimate thing the state could deal with for the sake of ensuring the functioning of the market, because you need accurate information
Of
for
course.
accurate prices and
Yeah.
investment decisions and the like. And
Well, the function of contracts and private property and everything. So yeah, there would need to be some mechanism by which the legitimacy of well, I mean, it all comes into contracts being upheld and ownership being legitimized and all of these sorts of things.
See, what I think would actually happen in a narco-capitalist society, because I do this all the time. You've got to have thought experiments, try and think through what it would actually be like in practice. Is I think fraud would explode without a government, and the process would be a lot harder because you'd have to take people to private courts and maybe hire private security firms, and it's difficult to see how it works. And yes, it may all be sorted out in the end, but it's going to be a real hassle and cost on business because there's going to be no constraints on. There's going to literally be no regulation.
But surely this must be the question that then sort of as a final question that comes back around is that as you delve deeper and deeper into overcoming all of the acknowledged problems of anarcho-capitalism or anything prior to that, at what point do you not wind up coming back to effectively the same damn thing? Where you could say, the taxation is exactly the same as the cost of your private security, your private health, your private blah, 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 blah. It's like if you're winding up paying 40, 50% of every dollar that you earn to all of these private institutions that wind up, becoming of such a size. How does it not wind up back in the same place anyway?
Not only that, but the libertarian, whether anarcho-capitalist, capitalist or classical liberal, really has no answer if the majority of the population decide they want a state again or a big state. There's really no answer to that. Because you can't go the aggression route, so you then got to accept that. So it's quite possible in an anarcho-capitalist world that the state makes a comeback, either because the people decide they want it because they don't like what's happening, or the way,
or what I say, it almost becomes the logical, most efficient way of answering the same problem. If everyone's paying for the same base services, it's kind of like,
I think what would happen is you get the Amazon state, because the business that's efficient and effective, it can just keep expanding, and people will want it to just take on more and more. And in the end, they may just say, let's live in the Amazon state. I mean, this is, the genesis of the state comes from powerful ruling families that acquire a lot of land and territory and wealth and then conquer more land. It goes on like that. But, and this is a risk in the Ludwig von Mises Miniker state as well, right? But this is my answer to that is, look, we couldn't rule out that the state will make a comeback. Maybe it's even inevitable, but it's worth going back to ground zero.
Yeah.
And letting it take 150 years.
Which comes back to what I was saying, which is just
that, worth it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also because at the moment, the state just keeps expanding, and that is going to create massive problems. We're not on a good path the way we're going. Like, it's kind of it's like the frog boiling in the pan. Maybe our grandchildren will realize, if they become historians looking back, that we just slowly morphed into some form of authoritarianism, and people did it willingly and embraced it without realizing, because you just don't notice. Like, it just keeps happening, and as we've discussed, you just accept anything the state does. That's what most people do. And so each step you just say, oh, well, I mean, there's a reason for it. They're trying to look out for us, protect us, help people who need help, and make the world a better place. So we'll just keep going, and then their grandkids live in a world where you have to walk in a certain way because that's the way we've decided you have to walk.
Yeah, that's
Or the
right.
state has.
Well, did you see Jess just wrote her latest article for Liberty Itch,
Yeah.
which was exactly about that and about essentially the upbringing of Generation Z. And she's exactly right. It's just absolutely.
And it's an interesting chicken and egg question there. Is that helicopter parenting driving statism, or is that a product of statism in that?
But it's as like you say, it's a chicken and egg situation. It doesn't really matter which came first. What matters is the cycle gets perpetuated ad infinitum until a certain end point. The chicken's got to die for the next egg not to be laid for the whole thing to end. Yeah.
Definitely that helicopter parenting, like you say, irrespective of the chicken and egg, it does help condition children to become compliant statist adults who trust mummy daddy state, just like their parents protected them from every scratch and thing that could happen in the world. And they're going to drive the expansion of the state, because if there's one problem that affects 3 people, they'll demand a law or an agency to take care of it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. It becomes self-perpetuating, and then there's the interdependence of everybody on the state, because that's certainly what I found when I started the business in Melbourne. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I started looking around the CBD, just going, nobody makes anything here. All anybody does is fills in forms to meet government requirements, and all of those forms ultimately go back to some government agency or require. It's just paper being pushed from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. And that then comes around to the real risk of AI in a society like Australia, where everything is so systemized, because all regulation doesn't actually actively do anything about any problem. It's just about filling in forms to say that you're doing stuff about the problems, so that then you could be sued later because you committed fraud on the form, rather than you actually committed an evil against people. So it rewards those people who are good at filling in forms, not the people who are actually good at doing the thing. Yeah. And we're seeing more and more people just get involved in essentially the policing of the forms on behalf of government, which is essentially what your accountants have become, and your engineers and your lawyers. Everybody is simply meeting the regulations that were being set forth endlessly by the government, and updating their skills to get the latest regulations to tick the next box and to provide the service. But in order to start, but it's just
hired for compliance.
That's all it is. It's just a self-administering administrative state. And when you try to start that small business, you need to get a permit, and to get the permit, you need, to do that thing in that building, you need to get this permit, that permit, and that permit. And the only way to get it is to jump through these hoops for these people, to so they can put ticks and boxes on pieces of paper. Nothing does anything. It's all just a total waste of time. It's a box ticking procedural thing. And when AI gets there, AI can tick the boxes. It's like, why do I need an expert to do this? It's all totally systemized. There's absolutely not, it's so rigid. There's no flexibility. Innovation is absolutely destroyed outright, because you can't actually do anything innovative, because it doesn't fit the boxes that you need to tick in order to fulfill the regulations and the regulatory requirements. So you're seeing the death you're seeing the death of innovation and opportunity and creativity and motivation. Tens of thousands of dollars needs to be squandered on getting these pieces of paper in order, so that you're allowed to open the simplest, most generic operation, which is all that you can really do. And that's why people then go and they just look at it and go, to hell with doing anything innovative. I'll just get that license to tick the boxes on the piece of paper so that I can sell the pieces of paper back to the next person. And then AI is going to come in and just go, well, we don't actually need people to tick these boxes, because it can all be assessed by a computer, because it's just a system. Yeah. It's really worrying, which then would seem to go, well, there's going to be a a collapse in society when everything falls to pieces under the weight of the indebtedness, the lack of productivity, because it might drive GDP that you're spending tens of thousands of dollars on signing forms to send back to government and all, but it doesn't actually create anything real. Which then comes back to my theory that it's just sort of like it's just an inevitability. This is how the USSR collapsed. It's just under the weight of its own corruption and incompetence and the death of all innovation that eventually it just implodes and you
then
start
there's
again.
Expanding direct programs that the government has, and I don't know how much you know about NDIS, but which is the fastest growing bit of it. I think it may now be the biggest outlay of the government. It's only like some years old, and it seems to me that just judging by some of the jaw-dropping services that
the money they're spending on people to do just nothing at all, just $100 an hour. I spend 3 hours driving to help somebody go to the toilet and then 3 hours driving back. It's just
someone was telling me not that long ago who knows about the system that they just brought in some reforms. This person was telling me some of the most egregious, funny, sort of tragically funny services that were being offered, and they said, well, they've just decided that people on NDIS can't now get sex workers provided. They can no longer have their cigarettes bought for them. They can't go on cruises. And it occurred to me, because I wasn't following it closely. I just assumed, like, when it was pitched, it was like to take care of the most fundamental basic needs of the people with the most severe disabilities. But it turns out that I think the ideology behind it was to provide people with severe disabilities with the same standard of life as a healthy middle class. Which makes sense for the Labour Party, actually.
Yes.
But I'm like, no wonder we are going to go bankrupt, because the cost of providing
but it's also then
that situation with the same standard of living when they often can't work and thus produce any wealth, and it's often not their own fault. But that's, like, as we've said, that is being subsidized by you and me, right? So it's coming from
you, but
or
I'm not there.
or printing money, borrowing, that kind of thing. And it's like, in an ideal world, would I like everyone to have that? Yeah, but I live in the real world, and it's like.
But even then, no, you wouldn't.
Why am I one of the only people saying, like, this can't go up $1 billion every couple of years, and for it not to have devastating consequences 20 years down the road, not to mention all the other growing expenditure and inflation and this, that, and the other. And it's like, you've got to draw the line somewhere. Why sex workers, really? Like, okay, maybe it's nice for someone in the wheelchair to have access to a sex worker, but is that something that needs to be taxpayer funded? I mean, can we not just limit it to the basic needs to ensure? I'm not talking like a North Korean, not the gulag, but surely there's a big gap between.
But then there's also that there's that other side, which is as a libertarian, the yin and the yang of responsibility and freedom. That the two go hand in hand, and it's you don't want to incentivize people to want to get on the NDIS because life could be better on the NDIS than it could be otherwise. It's sort of like when you tell me that I can get my sex workers and ciggies brought to me by, it's like, well, that sounds great. Sign me up. I'm going, I don't want my freedom. I want that. So I have no freedom, no responsibility, but I don't care because on balance, it sounds good. It's completely unsustainable, though. It's obviously the country can't sustain it.
I think certainly the Labour Party in this country seems to have a really poor understanding of incentives. It's like they've never heard of the word.
But socialists always do. The They don't understand that when you make unemployment more attractive than employment because you get paid more, that people just go, well, okay, I won't work because I'll get more.
You see
for
it
not
most
working
clearly in the trans issue. And it's like, so
yeah, that's right.
You're telling me, I'm like the 300th ranked man in this sport. You're telling me if I identify as a woman, I don't need to actually mess with my body at all, much at all. I can compete against women and break the record.
Yeah.
Get sponsors. Maybe
and anyone who criticizes and attacks me goes to jail or gets absolutely ripped to shreds.
You're telling me I can realize the dream I've always had, but I'm not talented enough to do it in the category of my biological sex, or I'm a male prisoner, and you're telling me
that's I was about to say.
If I tell you that
I can get away from this punishment,
you'll put me with a bunch of women. I'll be the only man in there,
naked in the shower with a bunch of women. Sounds great.
And
to
I'll
me.
literally be sharing a cell with a female, and I'm doing 20 years. You don't think maybe you're creating an incentive, an opportunity that certain people are going to exploit?
Yeah.
Like it's kind of you got to think about this with all policies. I mean, all political philosophy really hinges on human nature, and that's what sorts all of the different perspectives.
Yeah.
What do you think? Because what you think about human nature is going to govern what you think will happen if you impose this or remove that.
Yeah. And human nature is essentially the root cause of the problem. And again, it's because there isn't an answer. Everything is a compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much for your time.
My pleasure, Damon.
Sorry I had too much coffee and I rabbited on.
No, I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise.